It's great to be back. I first came to Winston-Salem, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago when Nathan Hatch invited me to give a commencement at Wake. And I will tell you, one of my first experiences with God is when you are about to give a speech to 12,000 people and you've never done that before. There are no atheists at commencement speeches. And I've been coming back quite often since, at Old Salem, back to Wake, or for other things. And I was just going around town today, going to different meetings, and what a sensational recovery is going on here. It's just, it's very hard. Some cities are exploding in good ways, and there are obvious reasons. Nashville. This is exploding in really good ways because of the community that you've put together, and not necessarily because there's an obvious reason. And it's just amazing. So I'm going to talk about community, and hopefully in celebration of the Winston-Salem Foundation. And before I do, I should say that it's not obvious that I would be the person talking about community, because I am not necessarily the most social human being on the face of the earth. When I was 7, I read a book called Paddington the Bear, and decided at that moment I wanted to become a writer. And I remember in high school, I wanted to date this woman named Bernice, and she didn't want to date me, she wanted to date some other guy. And I remember thinking, what is she thinking? I write way better than that guy. So those were my values. And then when I was 18, the admissions officers at Columbia, Wesleyan, and Brown decided I should go to the University of Chicago, which is a very nerdy place. They wear t-shirts that, sure, it works in practice, but does it work in theory? And the best thing about Chicago is it's a Baptist school where atheist professors teach Jewish students St. Thomas Aquinas. And so we were deep into that kind of solitude. And I was a hard worker at college. I double majored in history and celibacy while I was there. And then went off to a career as a writer. I took a job as a conservative columnist for the New York Times, which is a job I likened to being the chief rabbi at Mecca. And then I do some TV punditry in a show called The NewsHour. But even that is a nerdy form of TV. And we have a certain audience we're very proud of and we love it. We're a little older than the median age in America. We call them seasoned youth. And so if a 93-year-old lady comes up to me in the airport, I know what she's going to say. I don't watch your show, but my mother loves it. And so it's just a life of solitude. And so I write every morning, and my Fitbit, when I was wearing it, thought I was asleep every morning from 8:30 to 12. But I was just writing. My heart rate had gone so down. And then when you become successful as a writer, you get more solitary still. So my previous book did well, and I was on the book tour for 99 consecutive days. And I counted in the course of that period 42 consecutive meals I ate alone at an airport, airplane, or hotel. And when you're alone that much, you lose all your bearings. And I remember around that time, Britney Spears went kind of berserk and shaved off all her hair. And I was like, yeah, I could do that. I'm there. And so this is a life of not necessarily a relationship, but I do get to travel around, and I get to meet people. And I'm on the road a lot, and that produces immense benefits. And I've gotten to be in Winston-Salem. A couple years ago, I was in Wilkesboro, and spent a few days there and loved Wilkesboro. It's a town that had some advantages, lows and all that, went into the valley, and now tells a very compelling story of how it's coming back. There was a woman there at our dinner we had, and she said, we're makers, we make stuff here. And they're making places, and it's just a town that's on the revival. I've gotten to know Don Flo here I think about a year ago. We went to the building downtown, the community center, and it was a construction site, and now I look at it, it's fantastic. Been to Wake and had a chance to be with Nathan many times. And what being on the road as much as I am curious of is stereotype. Because people are doing things that defy all our generalizations. I was at a Trump rally, and I met a lesbian biker who reads Kierkegaard and recently survived a plane crash and converted to Sufi Islam and supports Donald Trump. Like, what stereotype is she fitting into? And you meet people who do the most amazing things, acts of love and care. There's a woman, we were just in Ontario yesterday, named Mary Gordon up there, who runs Roots of Empathy. And what Roots of Empathy does is they teach kids empathy. And the way they do it, they take a little mom and a little infant, and put them in an 8th grade classroom, and the students sit around the infant while the infant is crawling around. And they have to guess what's going on in the infant's mind. And in one of those classes, there was a kid named Darren who was bigger than the rest. He'd been held back a couple of years. He'd been run through the foster care system. He'd seen his mom die. And at the end of the exercise, he asked the mom if he could hold the infant. And the mom was nervous because he was big and scary. But she said, yeah, and he held the infant, and he was fantastic with it. And he handed it back to the mom and asked a bunch of questions about parenting, the last of which was, if nobody's ever loved you, can you still be a good father? And so you just meet I have a zillion stories of this nature, of people who have really are distinct one from another. And yet somehow we're in an age where stereotype and bad generalization seems to be the order of the day. And it's my view with doing all this reporting that many of our great problems flow from people not feeling seen. Blacks feeling that their daily experience is not understood by whites, rural people feeling not seen by coastal elites, depressed young people not feeling understood by anyone, people across political divides looking at each other in angry incomprehension, employees feeling invisible at work, husband and wives in broken marriages realizing that the person who should know them best has no clue. And so it's weirdly painful to be misunderstood. And part of this, I think, is part of the internet. Part of this is the market meritocracy where we're just competing with one another and not really pausing to relate to one another. Part of it, we're in a system that's turned off the emotional and relational and moral lens. There was a daycare center in Israel that had a problem. Parents were coming in late. And so they imposed fines on the parents. So they would come up on time so the teachers could go home. The percentage of parents who came in late to pick up their kids doubled. And that's because before, showing up on time to pick up your kids was a moral and relational duty so the teachers could go home. They turned it into an economic transaction. The moral and relational lens was turned off. The economic lens was turned on. And we do a lot of that in our society. And then the final thing to be said is we should give ourselves a little grace because what we're trying to do in this society, and especially in this city, is hard. We're trying to build the world's first mass multicultural democracy. We're trying to build a country where no group is going to have a majority, and we're going to learn to collaborate with each other. We're trying to build thick pluralism in immense diversity, and that's just a hard thing to do. And so it seems to me that one of the things that's crucial in this world, in this emerging world, is this ability to see each other. And as we talk about community, you can talk about it in all sorts of macro ways. But elementally, it's about one human being seeing another and knowing them deeply. And so I've come to appreciate the fact that there's one skill at the center of every healthy family, company, classroom, community, or nation. It's the ability to see someone else deeply, to know other person profoundly, and to make them feel heard and understood. And so I've been thinking about what is this skill. A hero of mine, John Ruskin, was a 19th century critic, and he said, the greatest thing a human soul ever does in this world is to see something and tell what it saw in a plain way. Hundreds can talk for one who can think, but thousands can think for one who can see. It's that skill of seeing. And if you read the Bible, it's filled with misseeing, people misrecognizing each other. The disciples, Jesus comes back and the disciples don't recognize him. In the Good Samaritan parable, the Levite sees the injured man on the side of the road, but he doesn't really see him. Only the Samaritan really doesn't see it, only sees him. And so it's this epistemology that we need. So what is it? Well, it's a kind of knowledge, but it's not the kind of knowledge of books. It's an emotional knowledge. Our hero here is St. Augustine, who came to believe that it takes love to truly know another person. Love is a focus of attention. Love is a motivational state to learn more about a person. Love is the drive to move in harmony with a person. In Hebrew, in biblical Hebrew, the word for love is yada. And in the Bible, it has dozens of different usages, including everything from sexual intercourse, being loyal to someone, understanding a person's character, or entering into a covenant. In the Bible, to love and to know are similar and overlapping categories. The heart and the head are similar and overlapping categories. And so what is this thing that some people have in abundance? We all know people who are so great at seeing. Well, I've part-time run this program at the Aspen Institute called Weave, the Social Fabric Project, and we go around the country meeting people who are really good at building communities. That's why we're in Wilkesboro. And these people are geniuses at relationship. And so I'm just trying to observe them. They walk in, there's a guy, Mac McCarter's from Shreveport. You walk into a coffee shop with Mac, in 5 minutes, everybody in the coffee shops, he knows their names. In the second visit, he's their best friend. In the third visit, they want him to officiate their wedding. Like, he's just great at this. And so I've sort of observed and tried to know, what is the skill? The first part of the skill is planting themselves down. Not being afraid to be particular. The people who know you know where they're coming from, and they're honest about it, and they're deeply rooted in their communities. You can't encounter another person confidently unless you're secure in where you're from, because otherwise the encounter is just too anxious. And so one of my heroes, my second messiah, is Bruce Springsteen. And Bruce Springsteen grew up in Freehold, New Jersey, and Asbury Park, New Jersey. And he had 2 albums which failed, but then he had a third one, which was Success, Born to Run. And the next logical thing was, you have this big national success, go global, write a big global album. And instead, he took 4 years off, and he went back to Freehold and Asbury Park, and he wrote about the local people there who were the roots of his emotional trauma. And he went small. And I saw him in concert in Madrid in a stadium with 65,000 kids, and I looked at their T-shirts, and their T-shirts said Highway 9, which is a highway in New Jersey that goes through Freehold. It said the Stone Pony, the little bar where Springsteen played in Asbury Park, Greasy Lake. And the lesson is, if you stay rooted at your place, and if your personality flows out of your place, people will come to you, and they sense a security and rootedness. And in that concert, I remember I'm looking out, 65,000 Spanish kids are singing, I was born in the USA, I was born in the USA. I was like, no, you aren't. But they sense that security. The second thing, from that secure base, the great parenting theory is that all of life is a series of daring explorations from a secure base. And so once that's a secure base, the people who are weavers, who are great at seeing others, they love social exploration. They love being the only one of their kind in the room. And so you see these people going out and just being with people completely unlike themselves. And they just get pleasure out of that because it's an adventure. The third thing they have is they've used their suffering well. Paul Tillich was a 1950s theologian who said that what suffering does is it carves through what we thought was the floor of the basement of our soul and reveals a cavity below. And then it carves through that and reveals a cavity below. And when you see deeper into yourself than you ever did before, which is what moments of suffering afford us, then you see that only spiritual and relational food can fill those voids. You also encounter this phenomenon that I wrote about in my last book, that in moments of suffering, when bad things happen, you can either be broken or you can be broken open. When you're broken, you shrivel up and turn hard and you make yourself invulnerable. When you're broken open, you open up and you make yourself vulnerable. And only at that point are you ready for a deeper life. And so they've been through hard times. There's a weaver I met in Athens, Ohio, named Sarah Atkins. She came home from antiquing with her mom one Sunday afternoon to find that her husband had killed their kids and himself. And she walked me through second by second that encounter. And she now has a free pharmacy. She has a foundation for women who've suffered violence. She gives her life away as a gift. And she told me, I did it because I was angry at him. Whatever he tried to do to me, screw you, you're not going to do it. I'm going to make a difference in the world. And a lot of our weavers operate from what Richard Rohr calls a bright sadness. They've seen the worst in the world, but their life is about spreading joy and deep, intimate connections. The fourth thing they've done is they've educated their emotions. They've achieved emotional granularity. I saw an interview with Taylor Swift on 60 Minutes, and somebody pointed out in the interview, a lot of your songs are sad. And she said, well, there are 21 kinds of sadness. There's your boyfriend broke up with you sadness, and she plays a tune. Your mom's mad at you sadness, a different tune. Your cat's lost, different tune. She knows 21 different kinds of sadness. There are a lot of people who don't have emotional granularity. They have not educated their own emotions. So all they've got is, I feel bad, I feel good. But if you can tell the difference between anger and hatred and frustration and anxiety and all the different emotions that are out there, if you have those modules in your head, you can react flexibly to life, and you can see deeper into other people because you actually know what's going on. Finally, the thing I've noticed about them is they're just really good at getting themselves out of the way. They have a capacity to be transformed. And when you see the Weavers and like Mac, who goes into a coffee shop and builds relationship, and you're the only person in the room for him, and he's going to ask you questions, more questions than you thought, because he just really wants to know you. You realize that deep seeing is difficult. Most of us don't take the time to do it. And yet you see it all around. I have a friend in D.C. whose daughter was a second grader, and she was struggling. And the teacher said to her in the middle of second grade, you know, you're really good at pausing before you think, or before you speak. And in that moment, her whole year turned around, because she said, the teacher knows me and values me. That's the thing I'm proud of in myself. And it really turned her around. My wife, Ann, who's up in the balcony, wrote a book, and one of the chapters is about a place called the Oaks Academy. And in one of those classrooms, a little kid was misbehaving. And the teacher said to him, your conscience must be really small today. And the kid didn't know what a conscience was, but he knew if he had one, he didn't want a small one. And so the teacher's like seeing it to him and seeing something in himself he doesn't even know about. And that's just a deep sight, and we've all had it. Think of those moments in your spouse. There was a moment like 3 or 4 months ago. We have a front door, and you can see it from our dining room table, and I was working. And the door was open, and my wife, Ann, was standing there looking at an orchid, which is right by the front door. And she was just casually looking at the orchid, and it was a casual moment where I happened to be looking up from my work and happened to see her there. And I had that sensation comes over you, and just in the ordinariness of a day, that I really know her. I know what mood is going to come after what mood, which is a lot. I know what makes her happy, what makes her joyous, what makes her anxious. I know the past, I know the present. And we have those moments with our spouses and our loved ones where you look at them, just suddenly say, I really know. And I ran across a quotation which is sad but captures a bit of what I was trying to understand, and it comes from a psychologist or a cognitive scientist named Douglas Hofstadter. Teaches at Indiana University. And he was married to a woman named Carol, and they took a sabbatical in Italy when their kids were 5 and 3. And in the middle of the sabbatical, Carol suffered a sudden stroke and died. And he had a picture of her on his dresser. And he looked at it every day, but one day he looked more intently than before. And he wrote this about the experience. I looked at her face, and I looked so deeply that I felt I was behind her eyes. And all at once I found myself saying, as the tears flowed, that's me, that's me. And those simple words brought back many thoughts that I had had before, about the fusion of our souls into one higher level entity, about the fact that at the core of both our souls lay our identical hopes and dreams for our children, about the notion that those hopes were not separate or distinct hopes, but were just one hope, one clear thing that defined us both, that wielded us into a unit, the kind of unit I had but dimly imagined before being married and having children. I realized that though Carol had died, that core piece of her had not died at all, but had lived on very determinedly in my brain. And Hofstadter is a cognitive scientist, and his work suggests that we are loops. His book is called A Strange Loop. across the brain power, our brains are just constantly interlooping. And when we meet somebody, we have neurons in our gut that send signals to the brain. Am I safe with this person? Am I not safe? Am I harmonizing with this person? Am I not harmonizing? And at some level, this act of relating, seeing each other deeply, is a gut relationship with each other. When you're in conversation with somebody, your breath levels will harmonize, your vocabulary levels will harmonize, your speed of talking will harmonize, all sorts of things start harmonizing. And so that's just part of moving on each other. And so far I've talked about weaving on the one-on-one level, but it's just a bigger version of that on the community level. One of my favorite definitions of community was from a book called The Death and Life of Great American Cities by Jane Jacobs, which came out in the early 60s. And she was on her second floor window at her brownstone in Greenwich Village, where I grew up. And she was looking out on the street, and there was an adult male pulling on a 9-year-old girl, both of them angry. And she didn't know whether it was a father just pulling on his daughter or if it was a kidnapping. And so she said, I better go down there. And as she was looking and about to go down, she saw that the locksmith had come out of his store. The fruit vendor had come out of her store. The butcher had come out of his store. And she writes, that guy didn't realize it, but he was surrounded. And that's what community is. It's just seeing. It's having eyes on the street and just seeing each other. And once you see each other and get to know each other, then you begin to pass on norms one from another. I'm always struck by, as I go around the country in this weave work, by how different norms are from one place to another. I was in New Orleans and I said, one of our problems is we don't know our neighbors. And they all had this quizzical look. I said, what are you talking about? We all know our neighbors. Where I live, if you knocked on somebody's door at 8:30 at night, it would be an outrageous invasion of privacy. In New Orleans, that's just what they do. And so you get these different norms, and sometimes norms get passed along one to another. I have a friend who lives in northern Louisiana named Rod, and his sister Ruthie was a teacher in their little town, and who died at 42. And one of the things Ruthie used to do, and she was just this magnetic personality, this joyful person, was on Christmas she wanted everybody to be remembered, including the dead. So she would go to the town cemetery and put a lit candle on every gravestone. And she died just before Christmas, and on Christmas Eve, Rod asked his mom, do you want to go to the cemetery and do what Ruthie did? And his mom said, maybe some other year, just too tough right now. And so they decided not to do it, and then they went over to a family's house, and they drove by the cemetery, and somebody else had put a candle on every gravestone. And so the community had set the norms. And then the final thing you notice in some communities is just a culture of vulnerability, where there's some code of safety within a town, within an organization, or within a community, where you just feel safe. And you create the vulnerability that creates relationship. We have a friend named Sarah Heminger who grew up in a small town in Indiana, and her father found out that the pastor was embezzling money. So he told the congregation, instead of getting rid of the pastor, they shunned Sarah's family. And so she spent 8 years of her youth almost alone, even the whole community not talking to them, extended family not talking to them. A couple Christmases in her grandmother's house, she and her brother in a separate room from everybody else. So she understood real loneliness. And she compensated by studying really hard. She's very smart, and she goes getting a PhD at Johns Hopkins in bioengineering. And she was driving by a high school called Dunbar, and she saw some lonely teenagers just hanging alone on the street. And she says, I know exactly what they feel. And in fact, I feel lonely, they look lonely, maybe we could be friends. And believe me, she has nothing in common demographically with those kids. So she created an organization called Thread, which creates extended family and relationships around the 450 most underperforming Baltimore school kids. And there's an outline of parents who are volunteers, grandparents, 12 collaborators, that when they get close to each other, their phones are close, and Sarah's engineer, so it registers on her app. So she knows exactly when each kid has been touched by a volunteer, which is a genius. But in her organization, she creates this culture of vulnerability, which she calls showing all the way up, or calling a thing a thing. And it influences the kids, it influences the volunteers, it even influences the board. And there's a woman on our board named Michelle Leff, who's Asian American woman, and she told a story to the board member, because even at the board meetings, they show all the way up. She told them a story she had never told her husband or her kids, that her father beat her brutally through her childhood. And she said, I used to be glad I was Asian American because I had thick hair and no one could see the welts on my head. And she attempted suicide, and she told the board this. And once she told the board, because she'd been encouraged by the culture, she said, I better tell my husband, and I better tell my kids. And she wrote a letter, which she allowed me to put in the book. And she'd been transformed by this culture that she'd somehow entered. And when she was at her worst, she was listening to Elton John. She was swallowing pills and listening to Elton John. He was the soundtrack to her depressing childhood. And this is when she was 13. When her daughter was 13, Elton John came to Baltimore. She took him to a Elton John concert, and she started crying. And she wrote, I wasn't crying because I was sad. I was overcome by emotions as my mind whipsawed between the stark contrast of my bleak childhood and my splendid adult life. I was listening to his music with my 13-year-old daughter, both of us laughing. My life is now rich and strong with healthy relationships. Life has turned out to be so much better than I ever imagined. And so the arc of the stories I've been telling you has been, the book is called Two Mountains. It's been a redemption story. It's by people who had a moment, but then had really hard times and grew from those hard times and fused from those hard times, and then achieved a second mountain, which is a bigger mountain, which is less about acquiring and more about giving out, less about elitism climbing up, more about reaching down and helping others. And Winston-Salem has a story that, to me, from the outside, looks like a two-mountain shape. It had the moments, the Reynolds, all this stuff I see around me, and then it lost that. And what a local person described today as post-large corporation leaving traumatic stress disorder. And now it's exploding. And this is, I think, what's happening to our country. We've had a long period of individualism and lack of community and a lack of social skill of seeing each other. And now everywhere I go, people are talking about connection and wanting to learn this skill. And that is the source of my optimism. Thank you. Now, having spoken about making connection with others, I'm not going to have a conversation with myself. I know. Oh, what is it?
No, sir, you are not going to have a conversation with yourself. We are certainly delighted to have you, and thank you for coming to Winston-Salem, and thank you for helping us celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Winston-Salem Foundation. So we're glad to have you here. I am so excited about this opportunity to be with you on the stage. Is that me? No. I'm excited to have an opportunity to have a conversation with you. When Scott Wehrman called me and asked me if I wanted to interview you, I said, are you kidding me? I said, are you really kidding me? And I want to thank you for the work that you do, for the columns that you write, for the books that you write. You always get us thinking about higher order kinds of things, so I really kind of appreciate that. And I'm glad to have you here because it's something I wanted to ask you because I've been such a big fan for so many years, and watching you on Meet the Press, and I would watch the column, people talk on the Meet the Press, and I said, when are they going to get back to David? Someone who can say some real good stuff. So I appreciate that.
That's what I'm thinking too.
Yes, that's right. That's right. When are they going to get back to him? So one of the things that I want to start with, and it's something I've been thinking about. I think it captures your work, And it's something I've had in my journal now for about 6 months and been putting it together. And I wanted to ask you about this. And this is the work from Henry David Thoreau. And so Thoreau he has this counterculture point that true social reform has little to do with politics, for genuine cultural change operates on cycles far longer and more visible than the perpetual churning of immediacies with which the political state and the political consciousness are occupied. Rather than dwelling with petty surface facts, as politics is apt to do, the true revolutionary and reformer dwells in humanity's largest truth, aiming to transfigure the deepest strata of reality. Here's my question for you, David Brooks. Are you, or do you consider yourself a reformer or revolutionary?
First, let me go to that Thoreau comment. It's a good, something I totally believe that. There's a great Samuel Johnson couplet, of all the things that human hearts endure, how few are those that kings can cause or cure. The thing we really care about is our relationships and our character. And those things can't be legislated. And somehow in my business, we spend 90% of our time on the part of life, or 90% of our time on the 10% of life covered by politics, and only 10% of our media attention on the 90% of life that is everything else. And we have a culture that's over-politicized and under-moralized. And so think about who can introduce an idea into the culture and how much that changes everything, or who can shift a norm. In 1950, nobody said I'm a feminist. In 1970, hundreds of millions of people said I'm a feminist. There was such power in creating that identity and in shifting that norms. We've just seen Me Too shift norms.
Right.
And sometimes movements succeed when they declare something disgraceful, like harassment or racism or even littering. And those are the things that really shape things. And so those changes can be big if gradual. Now I have to say, it's going to be boring. I wish I was a revolutionary. I was, like when I was 21. I'm mentioning tomorrow, if you go on YouTube and Google David Brooks, Milton Friedman, you can see a 21-year-old version of me debating Milton Friedman from a socialist perspective.
Wow. Okay.
And I've got these big 1980s glasses that were apparently on loan from the Mount Palomar Lunar Observatory, if you go. But then I became a reporter in Chicago, and I was covering these projects called Cabrini Green and the Robert Taylor homes.
Wow.
And they had been built by University of Chicago sociologists. And before then, it was all these wooden buildings. And they said, these buildings are so rickety. Let's tear them down and put up nice projects. And materially, things got better for a little while. But within those rickety buildings, there are all these social networks of support.
Right.
And when they tore out those buildings, they tore down those networks. And the people in the neighborhood's lives got materially better for a little while, then much worse. And now Chicago has torn down those big buildings. They got low-rise again. And so the lesson I draw from that is one of the core principles of my life, epistemological modesty. The world's really complicated and we can't really know. So change should be incremental, gradual, and constant.
I think you are a reformer. Okay. All right. You talk about communities and our nation having a social and relational crisis. Can you talk about this and how this has impacted our overall quality of life? You know, I hear a lot of people talking about a lot of different things in this country. I hear very few people talk about how important it is that we get back to an overall quality of life, a better quality of life.
Yeah, like, as you can tell from my remarks, I really believe that emotions are at the center of both our relationships as individuals, but even as our culture. And I live in Washington, D.C., which is the most emotionally avoidant city on the face of the earth. And if you talked about love at a congressional hearing, you know, they'd look like you're Oprah. But she has more wisdom than they do on a lot of things, putting that in the center of how we think about our politics. And I just look around at our society and I see, we were talking about this earlier today, college depression rates doubling, teenage suicide rates going up 70% since 2011, 73,000 people dying of opiate addiction, every year, 45,000 people dying of suicide every year.
Life expectancy decreasing 2 years in a row.
Right. And so the last time that happened was 1918, when we had a world war and a flu epidemic. And so that's the only other time it's happened in American history. And so when I look at this, I think this is social isolation. And unfortunately, a lot of people, when they're left, and this is natural, when you're left naked and alone, you do what your evolutionary roots tell you to do, which is you revert to tribe. And I draw this distinction between tribe and community. A lot of people have very positive associations with tribe, and I get that, but we have no other word. And a community is when you mutually love Winston-Salem together.
Right.
A tribe is when you mutually hate somebody else. And so it's based on mutual hatred of another. And so it's always drawing friend-enemy distinctions. It's always us versus them. It's always zero-sum mentality. It's a scarcity mentality. Everything is war. And we've now trying to build community, but we're trying to build it, many of us, in the wrongest possible way.
Yeah, that's great. One of the things that I read, and I love reading your new book, The Second Mountain, and you make the distinction between joy and happiness. So I'm reading your book, and it's late at night, and in bed, and my wife is asleep, and I love to talk to her when she's asleep. Because I said, look what David Brooks just wrote. The difference between happiness and love. And she looks at me, I'll go to sleep. But talk a little bit about that difference between joy and happiness. And then as we talk about it from an individual standpoint, how do we elevate that to communities? Yeah. I wonder what it would look like to be able to say and look at a community and say, that's a joyful community.
We've all seen them. I wonder if you like talking to your wife when you're asleep.
No.
Like, what comes out then? So the distinction I draw is happiness is when the self expands. Like you get a promotion and your team wins the Super Bowl, or something goes well in your life. You move toward your goals and you feel good about yourself, and you feel bigger. And that's good. I'm all for happiness. Joy is when the self disappears. When you lose the distinction between yourself and another. And so I collect in the book all these passages where people describe this, where they've just completely forgotten about themselves. And one of them is a long quote from Zadie Smith, the novelist, and she was at a nightclub in London, and A Tribe Called Quest comes on with Q-Tip, and some guy reaches out across the crowd she doesn't know, with big eyes, and he grabs her, and they start dancing, and she says, I was looking, my heels were killing me. I couldn't find my handbag. I was terrified I might die. But he kept saying to me, are you feeling it? And she says, I was feeling it. Right. And she said, we danced, and our heads, the top of my head flew off, and we gave ourselves up to joy. There's a friend of mine who's a poet well, he's now at Yale, but he was living in Prague. And he was writing poetry on his kitchen table, and a falcon landed on the windowsill. And he looked across, and the bird was so beautiful. So he called his girlfriend out of the shower and said, come here, you got to see this. And she's standing there, and he's standing there, and the bird turns its head and looks into the apartment and locks eyes with Wyman. And Wyman says, when that happened, I felt my insides crumble in, and I was like looking into centuries. And his girlfriend understood the power of the moment and said, make a wish. And Wyman wrote a poem about the experience, a stanza of which is, and I wished and I wished and I wished and I wished that the moment would not end. And just like that, it vanished. But that's a moment where he wasn't thinking about himself, it was just eternity. And I think some people have that all the time. The people who really radiate joy sometimes do it from a completely permanent state. And I meet these people all the time. They're just joyous people. This guy, Mac McCarter, I keep mentioning, joyous. I got to sit next to the Dalai Lama at some Washington lunch, and he didn't say anything profound to me, which was disappointing. But he just laughed all the time for no apparent reason. And I wanted to be polite, so I would laugh back, and he would laugh, and I would laugh. And through my weave work, I've gotten to work with Yo-Yo Ma.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that guy, he just radiates that joy. And it's like every human being he's met, it's as if it's the first one he's ever met. And he's like, wow, a human being, these creatures are amazing. And look, there's another one. And so that's his life. And so my conclusion is that we should shoot for happiness.
Right.
But if we make joy our North Star and aim toward that, our life will go well.
Thank you. We talked at lunch about the growing disparities between the haves and the have-nots, and I shared with you my perspective about, while I think, educational system, our economic system is just geared towards the top 10, 5%. The question I have for you that over the next 30 years, it's estimated that we have the greatest transfer of wealth in this country. What role might philanthropy play in creating a more just and equitable society?
Well, I do think, it's obvious that we're spreading into the haves and have-nots, and that goes in all sorts of directions. I wrote a bunch of different columns in 2015 under the argument, I'm not a Trump fan. Don't worry, Donald Trump will never get the Republican nomination. I was working for the New York Times, living in Washington, teaching at Yale. How could I be out of touch with America? And so this has been a revelation to me. I had been reporting, but I got stuck in a rut, and it can happen. And so I got stuck in that rut, and now when you go to all the places I've been in the past 3 or 4 years, you just see the vast disparities, and it's entering different worlds. And philanthropy can play a huge role. So here's a fact I learned this week. If the OECD is basically the 25 richest countries in the world. And in terms of federal support for social spending, we rank 22 out of those 25. Wow. When it comes to total social spending, we rank 2 behind France. So what's the difference? We have a lot more private social spending than anybody else. And that's philanthropy kicking in. And there's good ways to do philanthropy and very bad ways. And I think we're learning, a friend of mine said, and this was about Christians are really good at sharing resources. They're really bad at sharing power. And that struck me as a truth not only about Christians, but about a lot of philanthropists. And one of the things I've liked about what I've seen here, both at the Washington Foundation, and Don and I were talking about this backstage, you really do have to share the power. And we travel around the country, and we come from the Aspen Institute. We hit waves of suspicion. My wife wrote a story for a magazine called Bittersweet about a guy named Chris Lambert in Detroit, who was a white guy who he was building houses around Detroit, but he wanted to have a bigger impact. So he went to the poorest neighborhood in Detroit, and he acquired a school for $1 that was abandoned. And he poured $5 million into it, and then he decided to meet with the community to tell them what his plans for the community center he was going to build. And they heard, you acquired a building for $1. You're about to gentrify our neighborhood. And they said, you're a white supremacist, you're a colonizer, and they screamed at him for 2 hours. And he wanted to scream back and say, no, I'm doing this. And his African-American partner said, these people have not been heard for 250 years. You have not been heard for 2.5 hours. Why don't you sit and listen? And so it took a long time to get that shift in perspective, but there's a lot of that kind of learning that needs to go on. And so the philanthropy we have in this country is one of the great gifts of this country. And we were talking about this at lunch today. People give, Stanford has $30 billion or whatever. Harvard has an endowment in the billions and billions of dollars. I serve on the board of the University of Chicago. We just had a $6 billion fundraising campaign, which we easily met. I should say this because I'm on the board of a university I really love.
That's right. They're going to get
but
you.
Why give to schools like this? Like,
hey, Winston-Salem State.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Or, to be honest, Amazon can pick anywhere in the country to put its headquarters. They choose New York and Washington, really? That's right. Like Winston-Salem.
Yeah, I got you. That's right, Winston-Salem. And I told David we were going to do this. We're going to do a couple quick hitters, and these are basically quotes that I've gotten from your writing and from your work, and you just talk about them any way that you choose. First one is, crimes against the soul.
Yeah, I think when you lose the concept of a soul, you've lost a lot. And so I'm a secular writer, and I don't try to tell you to believe in God or not, but I try to tell people you should believe you have a soul, that there's some piece of you that has no weight, size, color, or shape, but gives you infinite value and dignity. And that we're not equal on the level of our brain power, we're not equal on the level of our physical power, but we're level on the equal of our souls. And if once you lose the concept that everyone has a soul, you forget how to treat people. And you do injury to them by non-recognition, non-seeing, generalization. You see them as a member of a group. But if you say, well, this other person has an infinite soul, then two things happen. You treat them with the dignity that they deserve. And second, you see them as a unique individual. And so, I was in Penn Station, part of my religious awakening, several years ago. And if you've been to Penn Station in New York, in the tunnels under the ground, it is the most soul-crushing place on the face of the earth. Yeah. But suddenly I had this awareness that every human being here had this infinite soul in them. And their souls were either sanctifying or degrading. Some of their souls were sick, some were joyous. And then you see the individuality and the personalism of each amazing human being. And it's just life-altering to see people that way. And I have to constantly remind myself, because we're like anybody else, we're on the move. But if you pause and think, oh, this is an infinite soul, then your reactions will probably be pretty good. And we've lost that spiritual language. I think we all know it, but we just lost the language.
Yeah, I believe we do. I think we do. As a psychologist, I can appreciate this one, falling through your ego.
Yeah, I mean, the ego is the ultimate enemy, and it's what makes you so unhappy. Because your ego is never satisfied. Your ego is fragile. It's, are they thinking about me? And the book is really about the processes you have to go through to lose your ego and not put your ego at the center. And some of it is just discipline. There's a great baseball pitcher, coach named H.E. Dorfman, who said, if you're on the mound, you should think about two things: pitch selection and the location of the catcher's mitt. That way you put the task at the center of what you're doing and not yourself. He says, if you start thinking about yourself, get off the mound. There's a great pitcher named Greg Maddux for the Atlanta Braves. Oh, yeah. And this guy came up to him after a game and said, how'd the game go? And Maddux said, 69 out of 75. The ball left my hand properly, 69 out of 75. After it left my hand, I had no control. So it's not my problem. And so that level of just not putting yourself at the center, not putting yourself at risk, at stake, is just the key to like any sort of tranquility. Now, I should say this, I wrote this book on why you shouldn't care about ego. You should go to a more spiritual second mountain. I'm on book tour. I'm checking my Amazon ranking every hour. And so either I'm a total hypocrite, which is very possible, or it's just very hard to constantly suppress the ego.
No, I appreciate that, and I tell folks as a clinician, we want to have a strong ego, but we don't want to be egotistical, and that's kind of the balance that you want to get in terms of ego. Becoming a good listener.
So that's part of this process of seeing. And I have a friend, I went through a hard time in 2013, and so you do what you do, you throw yourself on your friends. And so this guy, like me, is not a good sleeper, so we would have late night conversations on the phone. And I would tell him my problem, and after a few moments, and he would ask like 6 questions, and then I realized, in sort of in the rhythm of conversation, I'd expect him to pause, analyze, and give me his conclusion. But instead, he would ask another 6 questions. And so I came to think good listening is the capacity to ask those next questions that other people are not thinking to ask. And so that just is again, so many of these things are about time.
Right.
And this is, I don't know about you, that's my great weakness. Like I pull up to the gas station, I realize it's going to take 2 minutes to pump my gas, so I think, I can get 3 emails done. And so like even at waiting for an elevator, I'm pulling out my phone because productivity. And productivity is, we need to be productive, but it is the great temptation in a workaholic's age.
And now the marriage counselor in you, marry someone you're willing to have a good that you want to have a good conversation with.
Yeah. I used to teach this course at Yale, which the students called Therapy with Brooks, but which was really about how to make the big decisions of your life. And the idea was that at the core of our lives are 4 big commitments for most of us, to a spouse and family, vocation, philosophy or faith, and a community. And the one I cared the most about teaching them properly was how to choose a marriage partner. And the one they were least interested in was how to choose a marriage partner. Because they thought marriage, that'll something come 20 years from now. And so one of the bits of advice that I got from Nietzsche is marriage is a lifelong conversation. Marry someone you want to talk to forever. And then I would give advice about marriage. There's a good bit of advice, which is every time your partner leans to you, they make a conversational bid. Like you could be sitting there and say, look at that beautiful cardinal outside the window. And you can either make a toward bid, which would be to say, oh yeah, that is a beautiful bird. Or an away bid where you say, don't bother me, I'm reading. Or a nothing bid where you just ignore. And the good marriages have 5 toward bids for every 1 negative bid. And so what the relationship masters do in marriage or anywhere else is they look for occasions to express gratitude to the other person. And everyone's going to have negatives, you just got to swamp them with the positives. And then the bit of advice I also pass along is boast about your partner and have them overhear you boasting. Sometimes they say don't go to bed mad. Sometimes just go to bed. You're tired. Wake up in the morning, make breakfast together, it'll be better. And then the other one is if you want to bitch to somebody's mom about your husband, say, bitch to his mom and not to yours, because his mom will forgive him and yours never will.
Also intrigued by this whole concept called the Annunciation Moment. And I think about, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and he talks about, these transcendent type moments that we have, these aha moments. And it sounds like a little bit like that when you talk about that. Talk about those moments and share one with us.
Yeah. I mentioned mine when I read Paddington, and it's a moment early in life or maybe later in life that prefigures what's going to come later. And so in the book, I talk about E.O. Wilson, who was losing his family, I think in Alabama, and his parents shipped him off for the summer, and he was staying at a family he didn't know at a place called Paradise Beach on the northern coast. And he had never seen the ocean before, a bay. And he saw a jellyfish for the first time, and he was dazzled. He was 7. And then he was sitting on the dock, and he saw a stingray slid beneath his feet. And he lost one world, his family. He discovered another world of beauty, the ocean. He said at that moment a naturalist was born. And now he's in his 80s. He's one of our great naturalists. And what's interesting about these moments is how aesthetic they are, that we find something we think of as beautiful. So my daughter, when she was 5, she walked into an ice hockey rink and loved the hockey rink. Now she's 25 and she teaches ice hockey for the Anaheim Ducks. And it's just, somebody asked to paint her, why'd you paint? And she said, I love the smell of paint. I paint because I love the smell of paint. And so it's that aesthetic moment that calls us. And another Nietzsche comment is that if you take the 4 most beautiful moments of your life and draw a thematic line through them, you'll discover the law of your very nature, he says. And so it's that aesthetic sense that leads you in one direction or another.
Beautiful. Gratitude is the laughter of the heart.
Did I write that? This is a banality by now, but gratitude is the joyous moment. And frankly, we talked about the depression and all that. For the young people, and this is going to sound so fogey-ish, so get out your okay boomer signs. But I do think there's some loss of sense of gratitude in the culture, and especially among young people. And if you just, you think about, you get to go to a school like yours, among other things, highly educated people are paid to read your writing and pay attention to what you say. That's awesome. and that'll never happen again. and there's so much in a town like this or in our lives that we didn't earn and are much more than we deserve. And going around with that awareness, now I understand people are angry at injustice and all this other stuff, but somehow mixing the gratitude for what we didn't earn that we get with the injustice, it must be possible to hold those two emotions at the same time.
Okay. Beautiful. Oftentimes when I read your work and your books and your columns and I listen to you, I often wonder about who is David Brooks? Who's the man behind, who is this person? And so we're going to find out a little bit about who you are in this last little segment.
Great.
Find out who you are. Right. And this segment is called Either Or. You got to choose one, which one or the other. All right? Football or basketball?
Baseball. I'm an American male. Any ball that's floating around, people running after it, I love it. So I love both those sports.
I got you. I got basketball for you. All right.
With Wake, it's definitely basketball.
All right. I got you. Sweet potato or pumpkin pie?
In my New York head, I'm hearing bagel or bialy. Pumpkin pie.
Wrong. I'm thinking. Man,
It's just at Thanksgiving.
David, you're in the South. Come on. Sweet potato pie. Let's go. Oh, sweet or unsweetened tea?
Oh, definitely sweetened tea. I'm in the South.
We got you.
I'm getting the game now.
I got you.
Pandering.
Collard greens or Brussels sprouts?
Collard greens. Every day I'm eating collard greens.
Oh, you got it. You got it. Fried chicken or baked chicken?
I've got to say, I'm going with the fried. This is like that game where people are guessing that.
I got you. We got you. Tupac or Biggie Smalls?
So I actually have a theory on this one. So Biggie, I taught a course in contrasting Samuel Johnson to Michel Montaigne, these two 17th century writers. And Johnson was anguished all the time. And Montaigne was calm about himself. He was like, I'm good. And one of my students said, so Johnson was an East Coast rapper, and
Yes.
and Montaigne was a West Coast rapper. He's a little more like Snoop Dogg than Tupac, maybe.
Yeah.
But I'd have to go and think Tupac was the greater artist of the two.
There you go. I love that, man. Absolutely. Marvin Gaye or Barry White?
Oh, wow. Somehow I feel my whole romantic life for the next week is going to hinge on this answer. I'm going with Marvin Gaye.
Oh, man, excellent. And last one, Winston-Salem State University or North Carolina A&T?
Send your checks to WSSU.
Thank you so much. Thank you.